All right, so the fourth one that I wanted to touch on, so this is the explanatory note called Government Action to Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions. So people can find those notes. I don't know what it is, 4 or 5 pages or something on them. Might be a little bit more. Just want to give people a little bit of background around this. And I split this up in 3 areas because there's governments doing stuff, there's the supply chain doing stuff, and there are private businesses that see an opportunity in the carbon space doing stuff. And all of them will be communicating with farmers and people out there and the general public. I find it easier if I split them up into those different sectors. So first of all, if we run through the government one, this stuff that we think we're dealing with now actually started in 1988 when a group called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed. It was an initiative of the United Nations. So it was recognised back in the mid-1980s that there was an issue of increasing greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, and that was likely to have this glasshouse effect and impact on climate going forward. I remember being taught it in uni in the early 80s. So it's been around for a while and being talked about. But the first time the international community came together was in 1988, and there's 195, I think, or 196 countries that are party to this. The response being to graphs like this. So this is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent. So these are all the different greenhouse gases and how they've changed from 1800 to the early 2020s. And so the amount of greenhouse gases increased. There have been 2 sort of big developments in that. One was the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the second one was basically after the Second World War, where a lot of oil and gas was extracted over that 1940s, 50s period of this great industrial sort of expansion phase. The idea being, if it keeps going on that trajectory, we're going to get ourselves into a bit of strife. So in 1988, countries came together and said, right, we've got to do something about this. And their aim in 1988, and I'll put this up because I think it's really important to come back to, is to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, it's a lot of words, but there's some important things in that. First of all, it's about stabling these concentrations. It's not about getting them back to what we were in the 1800s, okay? It's about stopping that trajectory from still going up and picking a level that it needs to be at that will prevent getting anthropogenic interference with the climate system, means climate change, which we've shorthanded it to, but those really dramatic changes to the climate system, which will be catastrophic and unpredictable in what will happen. And that's basically all being driven by the heat in the oceans of where that's occurring. Okay, so that's what it was. So important that we're not trying to get it down to zero. We're not trying to get everything everywhere back to where we were in the 1800s. It's not that. But it's stabilising at a level which will be above where we were in the 1800s, but a level that doesn't create dangerous interference. So we're accepting that there will be some change to the climate, but just that we will be able to adapt and live with that. Okay. The IPCC Commission reports, called assessment reports, which I touched on, those AR reports, about every 5 years. So the 7th lot is being prepared at the moment. The IPCC don't do any of their own research. The IPCC commission people, so countries put forward scientists they would like to participate in that. So Australia puts a whole group of scientists forward. Mark Howden is actually the deputy chair of these committees globally. So he's from ANU. So Australian professor is the deputy chair of this stuff. And they look at the latest science, peer-reviewed science from around the world, and collectively as a group of scientists try and come to conclusions on what they should advise government on, both in rates of change, numbers and things like that. That's why those GWP 100 numbers keep changing, because as more science is done and more scientists put their heads to it, they agree that, hang on, that number's not quite right, we should change it to this or that. Or we hadn't picked up this, or we didn't appreciate the impact heat was having on the oceans and so on. That's where you hear all these reports come in on things like bleaching of coral reefs and all that sort of stuff. So they produce about every 5 years. This is what they look like. Some of them are thousands of pages long. But it's all the science brought together, of which then informs policy. And it's what they inform government on, but as I said, it shifts the goalposts. So we've just got to accept that the science isn't settled yet on a heap of this stuff and won't be probably in my lifetime. So expect the goalposts to keep shifting. Okay, they've shifted enough already. They're going to keep shifting as we go through it. So we've got to try and navigate a way of doing the right thing while the rules keep changing. Okay, to advance this stuff once a year, governments around the world that have signed up come to a conference. It's called the Conference of Party, or COP meetings. You've probably heard of those. And they've been operating for a while. And so there's been 28 COP conferences that have been run. The first one starting in 1995. There's another one to start very soon in November. Countries host them, and a lot of lobbyists are allowed to go too. So last year, there were more lobbyists from the oil and gas industry, or fossil fuel industry than there were from countries. So you get thousands of people there lobbying governments to try and come up with some collective agreements, because it's a global problem. 3 that I'll mention. One, people may have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. That was put together in 1997 at the COP3 conference. The importance of that from an ag point of view is that countries agreed to start benchmarking their emissions. And they agreed to a certain standard of accounting, and that they would calculate those numbers and they would table them to the rest of the world community, so everybody could see how every country's emissions were tracking, not only where they were coming from, which sectors they were coming from, but what the trends were over time. So Kyoto was a really important one to establish that the world agreed to. That's then been superseded largely in 2015 with what was called the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement went further, not only tidying up all the accounting stuff, but there was a legally binding treaty signed by countries around the world that we would aim for carbon neutrality by 2050. So the Paris Agreement was where this carbon neutral by 2050 has come from. And that's why countries have that long-term ambition for carbon neutral by 2050. That doesn't mean sectors within a country can't be carbon emitters and others can be carbon sinks. But overall, the country has to balance out to be carbon neutral by 2050. Okay. And what they were aiming for, along with that as well, which I haven't written up here, is that this is now not the amount of greenhouse gases, but the warming of the planet over that same sort of period. So this is the industrial one, and this is the level of warming. And they went up to about 2010 around here, and then they said, if we keep pumping gases into the atmosphere at different rates, where do we think the climate will and the temperatures will head? So they have what's called these representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, which is a bit hard to read, but basically they were different scenarios. And the scenario that was agreed to is that what we will try and do is ultimately keep temperatures below 2 degrees and pursue an effort to try and get to 1.5 degrees, which is what those 2 lines represent. So with the trajectory we were on, we were going to go well and truly over that. So the idea of the carbon neutral by 2050 down here is to make sure that we don't overshoot that, and if anything, start coming down that way over time, or at least keep within those bands and not follow these pathways, which we would follow according to the science if we didn't mitigate any of the carbon that was being released through the various sources. So the Paris Agreement is super important. That's where this 1.5, 2 degrees stuff you hear, it's where the 2050 stuff has come from. And the more recent one, which was Glasgow in 2021, and people may remember the Liberal National Party tying themselves in knots to know what target they were going to take to Glasgow at the COP26 conference, is their countries had to come with interim targets. And this is the one that's been causing a lot of grief with countries, is that you need to set an interim target by for 2030. And also at Glasgow, a number of countries signed up to what was called the Voluntary Methane Pledge. So some of the big countries, India, China, Russia, didn't sign up to it, but the US did and Australia has. So it has some implications there for focusing just on methane as one of the gases. But the 2030 interim targets is really important. That's why you'll see so much stuff spoken about aiming for stuff by 2030. It's driven out of the Glasgow COP26 conference. Countries have to announce in Feb of next year their 2035 interim targets. And so the Australian ones are being set at the moment and will probably be, the draft of those will come out in the next month or so of what our 2035 targets will be. Governments have the right within these interim targets to change them, and that's why the Labor government changed the interim target for 2030 from the previous Liberal government, and I imagine if the Liberal government gets back in again, they'll change it again. So the interim targets can potentially change over time. As different governments come in, the 2050 pledge is one that's a legally binding international agreement. So you won't see the 2050 shift in the countries, but the interim targets will on the way through. Okay, a couple of other issues to address. So this is government to government stuff, okay? And those agreements set some of the rules that now we're having to work around or work with. Okay. Some of the other ones that are about is that some countries have now started introducing carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or CBAMs they're called. Europe was the first one to do this. It's basically a trade tariff. So after spending 40 or 50 years trying to get freer trade agreements, everybody is now popping up with these carbon border adjustment tariffs to level the playing field. So what that really means is that some of the very emission intensive products that are produced, things like steel, fertilizer, cement, aluminium, those sort of things that emit a lot of emissions can't be created by a country that has slacker emissions controls and then import them into a country that has tighter emissions controls, because those emissions controls have costs to that country. So the EU have put CBAMs on a whole lot of products coming in from places like China and India around steel and cement and so on, because they don't have the same environmental carbon credentials. Australia's doing a CBAM at the moment. It's called I can't remember, a voluntary something or the other. It's called, but it's quietly in the background looking at should we be putting tariffs on things coming in from other countries because our local suppliers are being disadvantaged by the carbon emission rules that they have to follow in this country, but other countries don't, and therefore can dump products into a sort of cheaper price. So this will happen all around the world now, that you'll have these adjustment mechanisms coming in place. So what's the Australian government response to all of these international agreements? First of all, our target with this current Labor government is a 43% emissions reduction by 2030 from 2004-5 and net zero by 2050. It's often referred to, you'll see it referred to as our nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So this is what government is claiming. This is what government is striving towards. And all of the other policies are driven out of what is the target we are trying to achieve by 2030 from 2004-5. Okay. So that's the first one, first response from government. The second one is that because the Australian government signed up to the methane pledge, the aim is to reduce methane by 30% from 2020 to 2030. Now, methane is not only produced in the ag industries, there's a huge amount of it that comes from the fossil fuel industries. You know, natural gas is methane. A lot of methane leaks out of oil wells, leaks out of coal mines and so on. So there's a huge amount of methane that comes out of other sources, not just agriculture. But it got in the target because if we can reduce this, and because it breaks down quicker than the other two gases, we potentially get a better impact or a better win in the short term than we do by focusing on those other gases. So that's why methane has become part of that, the targets that have been set. The third one is that we produce national greenhouse accounts. That's what the 2022 version looks like. I'll show you a couple of graphs out of this. I've also put this in your pack as a PDF because this is the latest version. This essentially is what's been driven out of the Kyoto Protocol and then more recently out of the Paris Agreement. So the calculations, so this is the national report that the Australian government tables to the world on what our emissions are from what sectors and how it is changing over time. It started back in, I think it was 98, 99. So there's about 25 years of annual data in that. There are standard ways that has to be calculated from country to country. So countries don't use different calculations and different assumptions in their calculations. The important thing for us in ag is that the emissions calculators that we will be using later on, today and tomorrow, are built from this. The rules that are set in this are the rules that are then flow through to our calculators. The columns that are set up, the frequency of reporting, the types of things that are reported flow out of this. Okay, so when you look at our farm calculator and go, why doesn't it include this? Why doesn't it include that? It's because the national accounts don't include it. That will change over time, but at the moment, that's the history of why our calculators look the way they do. It's driven out of this. Okay, so the next thing that government has done is they've implemented what's called the safeguard mechanism. Now, as I said, the safeguard mechanism had been around since Josh Frydenberg, I think, brought that in. So that was about 2011, 2012, but it never had any teeth. The idea of the safeguard mechanism is that the top 215 emitters, so any emitter in Australia that produces more than 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per year got scooped up in the safeguard mechanism. There's only one Australian agricultural company that qualifies for that. Every other country is below, every other company is below that. So agriculture isn't actually hoovered up in this, but a lot of big companies are. The idea of it being is that there's a limit that's set for your business of X many tonnes of emissions, and then you have to reduce that by 4.9% per year every year to 2030. So it's a really significant pressure on big polluters, if you like, or big emitters in the country to reduce their emissions. Ideally, those emissions are reduced by efficiencies within the business, so they emit less. But there is a provision if you cannot, despite your best attempts, reach that 4.9% emissions, you can buy carbon credits to offset that, so you achieve your 4.9%. Okay. Two implications that are flowing from that, obviously now. One is that some of these big companies are saying, if we can't get emissions, where can we get credits from? And they're tweeting pretty quickly that they may as well create ACCUs in-house. And so they are buying land and looking at ways of being able to store carbon for their own use, create ACCU to store carbon for their own use. So there is agricultural land being purchased at the moment with the sole purpose of being put into trees, fastest growing monoculture trees that will capture the most carbon to generate the most credits so that they can achieve those offsets through ACCUs. Government said that should only be for the hard to abate sectors, but just about everybody's trying to put their hand up and say they're a hard to abate sector and therefore can use ACCUs as part of their crediting scheme. If not, they have to go to the Australian market and buy ACCUs if they can't get ACCUs by other means. So basically means there's a lot of pressure and there'll be a lot of ongoing pressure in agriculture to either generate these ACCUs, because there aren't many other industries that can create ACCUs apart from agriculture and farming, or we're going to have pressure on for competing land, particularly in higher rainfall, high growth areas, because that's where they maximise their ACCU generation. And the last one is that the Australian government, as we all know, operates the ACCU scheme, the Australian Carbon Credit Unit scheme, which I'm sure everybody would have got enough of at the last training to know what an ACCU is. And they also, which did go under the radar at the last training, was they also run a climate active verification program. So another government department, not environment, Department of Industry, Science and Resources, run a program called Climate Active, and they will verify, basically be an auditor and help, well, first of all, set up, but then verify claims of neutrality or claims of low carbon emissions. And I'll come back to this one and touch on this when we talk about insetting, possible insetting for farmers tomorrow. So they're all the things the government does as part of their response to those mechanisms that have been put in place. If I then pull out just a couple of graphs from this report, it's about 400 or 500 pages long, the first volume. The second one's about another 500 pages. It's got all the assumptions in it. This is Australia's greenhouse gas emissions as reported to the international community from 1989-90 through to 21-22. The purple lot is agriculture. So agriculture makes up and has consistently made up around that sort of 15 to 18% of Australia's total emissions. The biggest sector by an absolute mile is the energy sector. So that includes things like transport and other sort of manufacturing type processes where we're using energy. One that's worth keeping a note on, though, is this top green one here. This is called the land use change and forestry. So basically, if the graph's on this side of the axis, it means that the land use was a negative emitter of greenhouse gas emissions over time. And you could see once we got to about 14, 15, when land clearing was reduced, and in fact, in a lot of cases, land clearing permits were taken back, and now we've allowed for some natural regeneration to occur. That's why this is at the bottom bit of the ledger, that our overall emissions, which is that dotted line there, has steadily gone down. And it's steadily gone down because basically we've reduced this and added this to it. So that's where a big change in our emissions, when we talk about we're on target to reach 43% by X time, it's primarily been because of the change in land use, the land use change. And there's a bit of argy-bargy at the moment that the agriculture sector coming from agricultural land, that sequestration, and because we're trying to operate this on the same parcel of land, that should be our credits and not the government's credits. But anyway, bit of argy-bargy over that, but that's the way we're tracking at the moment. So you can see a lot of other sectors haven't changed by much, and in fact, agriculture by itself hasn't changed by much. If we just take the purple bit then, just the agriculture sector, and look at that graph, that's the way it stacks up. And I think this may play into the comment that Cole made or asked about, is agriculture being picked on, and particularly livestock in agriculture picked on, because this light green stuff that's in there is enteric fermentation. That's basically methane from ruminant animals. So of the total contribution of agriculture over the, of that 15 to 18% of Australia's national emissions, the vast majority of it comes from enteric fermentation from methane. Okay, there's a bit that comes out of some of the other ones, manure management. So that's piggeries, feedlots, chook sheds, dairies, that sort of stuff. A little bit there in urea, which is a dark one at the top there. And things like burning, we talk about that as an issue. Really, it's not very big in the scheme of things. And there's the natural leakage from those agricultural soils on the way through. But take-home message for me out of that is you can see why people are picking on livestock and methane, because it's the biggest one, and on the surface, an easy one to solve, because if you could stop it overnight, then over time, well, within a 100-year time period, that methane that had been produced will have disappeared and will keep disappearing. So it's the reason why it's a bit of a target. So that's the National Inventory Report. It's 4A in your pack of stuff. The new report will be coming out in the next few months, so that will just update another year on that. When the goalposts change based on the AR reports and the Australian government accepts them, and the official way of knowing the Australian government's accepted them is because they put them in the change the National Inventory Report. That National Inventory Report will be backdated for the 25, 30 years of data they've got. So when those global warming potential numbers change or other calculations change, that will be backdated as part of that. So if you're bored and you want to read, you can read some of those. There's some interesting emissions in it, inclusions in it. Yeah, the reason why this is declined, so the green, while it's really big, it's declined, it's because of a reduction in sheep numbers primarily. We've gone from about 100,000 sheep over here to about 58 or 60,000 sheep or something, a million sheep over here. And in fact, it's, you can be a bit naughty, and the red meat industry has been doing that. They've found where the peak was, and then they've found where the trough was, and they claim over a 20-year period X amount of reduction. You can pick whatever numbers you like at different times. If you picked it from there going up to there, you'd say that you've had an increase over time, or that there's been no change over a 10-year period. So yeah, it's primarily the change in agriculture has primarily been through the change in livestock numbers. Okay. As far as this one goes and emissions, and yes, we've got a much greater population, they don't count it per head. They count total quantity or conversion of total quantity. So wouldn't matter if we had twice as many on the planet. If that bar still stays above that, then we're not carbon neutral. Okay, to have zero emissions, that bar graph basically has to be down here. Oh, sorry, that dotted line has to be down here. So number of people, doesn't matter a toss, you're still putting carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Just stop doing it. My understanding is this is from feedlots, so management of manure from feedlots, piggeries, chooks, and some dairy stuff is included in that manure management. There's obviously some manure it's called manure management in the extensive livestock as well. So when we jump into the tool and you see the calculation, there is a tab called manure management, but it's relatively small compared to the contribution of it, relatively small compared to some of the other more intense industries. And it's mainly because the more intense industries, of the emissions that are coming from that manure, because they are higher quality feed, there's more nitrous oxide that gets lost in some of that manure as far as emissions go, and you get pinged much more for it. So when you convert to a carbon dioxide equivalent, you don't need a lot to actually get a measurable CO2 equivalent impact on it. This break, once you get to the actual tool itself, the gaff tools themselves. So some of these things have sort of been lumped in together in the calculations that are here. So field burning of residues is a specific part of that. Some of the leakage is the stuff I think you're referring to is actually tied up in the agricultural soils bit, and you've got to unpack that. So you've got to unpack, this bar here to know a bit more. We'll understand more about that when we get to the tools. Okay, this is just chunks some of the stuff up into bigger lumps.